This video is going to be breaking down my submission for the PWNISHER boss fight render competition. The very first thing I did was create the texture for the eye. I actually did this on a live stream, so if you tuned in you would have already seen this process. This whole thing is just a combination of a load of different types of noise textures and then a couple of fire elements for the inside of the pupil as well. And then the trick to this really is just loads and loads of layers to add the complexity and detail. I used two different types of noise textures and there's about 6 or 7 different instances of them. And then finally I drew a very simple rotor shape for the actual pupil of the eye. I gave it some slight animation to give the eye some character. Once that was done, I rendered that out as an EXR sequence and it's ready to go onto some Geo in Blender. From here I actually started blocking out the 3D scene. I started off with the very background. I took a chunk of a UV sphere and did some sculpting to it to make it a bit more uneven. And then I just used a basic PBR rock texture setup that I got from textures.com and used the displacement map to add some extra detail. Then for the lava underneath, I set it up and I used the emission map that came with the texture to create the light source. And I made it really intense so it would light the scene from underneath with that nice orange glow from the lava. I added a similar rock texture onto the foreground bridge. The model for this was just a placeholder and I actually changed it at the end of the video. Then I modelled the kind of forked rock that the eye is attached to. Again, the actual geo for this was really simple. I just modelled it from an extruded cube and added a subdivision surface modifier, and then I used a displacement map from the rock texture to add all of the detail. Then I imported a few models that I downloaded. These are some stalagmites and stalactites that are going to be hanging from the ceiling and coming up from the bottom of the frame. I had a couple of different ones, so I placed 3 or 4 of them in the scene and rotated them just so they weren't all exactly the same. Then the main one is this big archway that I found. It looks really cool and compositionally it works nicely, almost like a natural vignette in the frame. Once all the geo was blocked out, I started working on lighting. I added a couple of disc area lights. I made them super bright to emulate the light from the eye, and then I used some noise modifiers to animate them to flicker. Because the speed of the scene goes from real time to slow motion and then back to real time, I had to use 3 different ones and then use the restrict frame range feature to blend them into each other. So the first one is very high frequency and it fades off over about 10 frames at the beginning of the shot as the camera slows down. Then the middle one is a similar strength but much slower. And then for the third one, it's the same settings as the first one, but it fades out at the end instead of the beginning. At this point I did a first render and just started doing a rough comp in Nuke. Here I just did the basics to get a feel of how the scene was going to work and what I needed to put the most time into. So I'm adding some soft glows onto the whole shot, making sure that this is not too heavy-handed. I also used the depth pass to add a bit of haze into the back of the cave to make it feel like it was a big space. Then to bed the eye into the shot, as well as being a 3D render on some geo, I wanted to also use lots of real 2D stock elements to make it feel more embedded. And the fact that it's real fire also makes it feel a lot more organic and realistic. These are some fire elements that I downloaded from Action VFX. I had them starting in the centre and going off to the side of the frame, and these are going to be coming out from behind the eye. Next I added some bolts of lightning coming off the rock which are going to be attached to the eye. There's a cool gizmo you can download for free for Nuke called X Tesla, which is really good for lightning, so I used this. And I linked the start and end point of the second one to the end and start point of the first one. This goes on top of the fire, and then it's time to start layering up some atmospheric stuff. The first one I use is this evaporation fog. This is going to be behind everything in the background of the cave, and it's just used to mist everything up in the background and give it some more depth. Then I put this on a 3D card and placed it in the shot. I placed it further back in 3D space, so there's a nice parallax in the shot as the camera's orbiting around. Lastly, for this element I used a ramp node and graded the bottom of the smoke to be brighter and warmer. This was to fake the lighting interaction that's meant to be from the lava out of frame. Then I added a second smoke layer. This one's going to be right in the foreground on top of pretty much everything in the shot. I did my usual trick of blurring the background and then multiplying it over the smoke, so the smoke then inherits the lighting intensity and the colour of the scene. Next up we've got some embers and sparks that are coming off the back of the eye. Like I was saying earlier with building the eye textures, the trick with this as well is just loads and loads of layers. Bit of grading just to get it to match the intensity of the fire, and then I got another floating ashes element and put it right in the foreground. This one is specifically one that's actually filmed with stuff that's close to the camera, and so the different scales of the ashes make it feel like it's more of a 3D effect than just a 2D element slapped on top of the shot. And then there's also one more drifting embers element that just goes on top as well. One of the finishing touches to this bit of the comp was some heat distortion. You can see here I'm trying it out on a checkerboard. I find this much easier to see what it's actually doing than putting it on the whole shot. I did 2 instances of this. I did one before the foreground character and everything goes on top, and then I had the foreground layer which has a separate treatment with heat distortion. This makes it feel like there's more heat distortion between the character and the eye, which helps to add some separation into the scene. I had an idea to put some slow-mo lava splashes in the background, and also really hit home the idea that the shot goes into slow motion. So I found a couple of different water splash elements. They're already in slow-mo, so I sped them up at the beginning and then let them go back to their normal speed for the slow-mo section. Then I just graded them to be more of an orangey red colour and put a subtle glow on them as well. Then it was time to actually make a character. The first thing I did is just use a generic model of a human, and I scaled it down to be hobbit proportions. They're much smaller and quite stocky, and they also have much bigger feet than normal humans. From there, I isolated a couple of bits of the geo to make a t-shirt and the trousers. I don't really have any experience making clothes, so this isn't necessarily the best way to do it. This is just how I did it quickly. I separated those faces from the rest of the model and then scaled them up using Alt-S just to scale them in the normals slightly so they were on top of the skin. And then I jumped into sculpt mode and used the cloth brush to add some wrinkles into the clothes. The cloth brush is absolutely amazing. I literally did this in about 5 or 10 minutes and it adds so much detail and intricacy into the model. Then obviously he needs some hair, so I painted a vertex group for the hair density, and then added a hair particle system onto this, and just played around with a load of the settings to get the clumping and stuff to look kind of like Elijah Woods in The Lord of the Rings. It's not absolutely perfect, he looks a little bit like Frodo Bon Jovi Baggins, but it'll do for this scene. I gave the hair the principled hair shader in Blender, and then for both of the clothing items, I just downloaded one image texture of some dirty cloth and used that as the basis of the texture, as well as a normal map of some cloth wrinkles just to add some extra detail. After that, he needs some rigging so I can actually move him. I used the Rigify add-on, I absolutely swear by this now, I use it all the time. So I just line up all the bones with the character to make sure it's the correct scale, and then generate the IK rig, which is absolutely amazing. I love animating with this. Animation really isn't one of my strong points. The fact that it's slow-mo helps a little bit. It removes that element of uncanny valley where the movement looks a bit odd because it's so slow it's kind of harder to perceive. I just went through and blocked out all the main poses and then refined the keyframes in between where needed. For some extra detail that you can't even really see in the shot, I added some wind and then used a noise modifier on the strength so that it goes up and down, which makes it a bit more turbulent, and just blasted this straight into the character's face to get some dynamics on the hair. Once that was set up, I turned on the hair dynamics and just baked it and tweaked a couple of the stiffness settings until it looked good. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning, the very last thing I did is just tweak the model of the rock bridge. The initial one was pretty much all just relying on displacement maps, but I just felt it wasn't quite working, so I ended up using some brush alphas of rocks to quickly get some nice rock shapes into the ground. And that's it. I'm super happy with the render. I think it's probably the best one I've done yet for any of these challenges. Like most of my stuff, I'm relying very heavily on my comp skills to make the 3D renders look better than they actually are. The total time I spent on this was probably 3 or 4 days scattered over a couple of weeks. If you'd like to see a more in-depth breakdown and tutorial, leave a comment below and I'll try and get round to it in the next couple of weeks. For now, thank you very much for watching, good luck to everybody else entering the contest, and I'll see you soon.